Greetings friends, welcome to my channel. I am Alexander Musienko. Today is April 23rd, Wednesday, and on this day I present to you the traditional briefing with operational information on the events that I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. I will start with some very good, pleasant news. The fact is that just yesterday evening, reports began to come in from the Vladimir region in Russia, where the 51st Arsenal of the main Missile and Artillery Directorate of the Russian Ministry of Defense is located. Reports were coming in about detonations, explosions, and fires at the arsenal, and they were quite powerful. Initially, this appeared in various local public forums. Then Russian media began to actively report on it, and the regional governor started talking about the fact that indeed very serious fires are currently happening. And in fact, this became known. Overall, this arsenal is one of the largest when we talk about such facilities. Its area is approximately 3.5 square kilometers. The arsenal is equipped with both above-ground storage facilities and the capability for placement, as well as underground ones. By the way, Russian war correspondents, the so-called bloggers, have already started accusing the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian authorities. They claim that, as always, negligence and careless storage of ammunition, practically in open areas, is evident in their accumulation. Well, they could have actually contributed to what happened. They are already blaming each other and saying that supposedly Shoigu is no longer the Minister of Defense, but rather involved in corruption. His affairs might continue to exist and thrive, even under Belousov. Although Belousov is the current Minister of Defense of Russia, he was called a sort of technocrat who would supposedly bring order, and everything would be very good, but as we can see, it didn't happen. This is military unit 11785, located approximately 530th kilometers from the state border with Ukraine. It can actually store approximately 274,000 tons of ammunition. As the experience of past strikes on similar facilities shows, they typically stored missiles, ballistic missiles, and missiles for the S-300 systems, which Russia has been using recently, primarily for striking ground targets. And all of this could have been stored there along with artillery shells, mines, ammunition for small arms, and so on. It must be said that after 2024, when we had the experience of successfully striking such objects, Kotluban and others, Russia began to employ a tactic of decentralization, and essentially a tactic where they were placing ammunition in various locations. That is, a large number of field depots to avoid the concentration of these shells and ammunition directly in one place where they could be stored, and the trap that came to the trap, real ones. I want to remind you that there was an earthquake at that time, even across the territory of Russia near the place where the corresponding arsenal was located, and other objects showed that they are extremely vulnerable. Entire commissions were created. At that time, they were determining whether these arsenals were built and whether all safety and security conditions were met. Such similar objects, that is, they were considering all this, discussing it, but as we can see, they discussed it thoroughly. Nothing will save the following, which we need to understand whether we can theoretically allow it. So far, there is no official information from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. As soon as there is, I will inform you, of course, and we will find out about it. But now we can really put forward various versions, assumptions, and theoretically discuss what could have happened, what could have been the cause. Well, of course, one can put forward the version that ballistic missiles, which the enemy used to shell, among others, Sumy, Kryvyi Rih, and not only, could have been stored at this arsenal. And Ukraine will carry out systematic work to reduce the enemy's ability to launch terrorist criminal strikes on Ukrainian cities and civilian targets. This is absolutely obvious and understandable. Could this persist? Secondly, This warehouse could have been used as a large logistical hub, a huge logistical hub. According to, judging by the detonation, which has not stopped until this morning, there was a huge amount of ammunition. This is noticeable to the authorities. The local authorities are evacuating at least 3,000 people from the epicenters of the explosion. So it can be said that the volumes are indeed quite significant, which could then be transported for Russian troops to conduct combat operations and provide support on the front. This is also something that could have happened in any case. This is an important facility, and its loss will have serious implications for Russia. This is the second thing that needs to be understood and what someone needs to comprehend. It seems, of course, that there are many flammable substances, ammunition, shells, and missiles. And naturally, there are explosives that can detonate, which will cause a serious fire and destruction. And therefore, well, it would seem vulnerable there. In reality, as a rule, arsenals, even if they are built there with a component of corruption and abuses, and even if some rules are not followed, generally, they do provide for certain regulations. And the operation techniques that practically prevent the detonation of the entire arsenal at once, there are appropriate fire safety techniques and so on. Therefore, to succeed in destroying such an object, significant efforts must be made. First, you need to hit more than one spot. If we are specifically talking about the act of hitting, you need to hit several places simultaneously to cause destruction through detonation and fire. And it has to be something heavy. Essentially, that's what can be said for now. Conclusions will be drawn later. When, of course, we have the official information. This is what needs to be understood here. Well, in the meantime, and the publication, Axios had a lot of reports yesterday. And the Financial Times wrote that supposedly Putin, the Russian dictator, is ready to cease hostilities along the line of contact. And well, essentially what is called a freeze of the conflict, supposedly, then Peskov's mustache, Peskov's mouth, call it what you will, denied all of this, and so on. So, well, there were different factors. But what the Financial Times wrote that allegedly ready. Well, and now the publication on Axios, and why do I emphasize Axios? Because as a rule, it is an American publication that has, well, quite well-informed sources, as previous experience shows. So, Axios published the initiatives and proposals of Trump that were allegedly offered back in Paris, and they will be discussed today, April 23rd, during a meeting with the Ukrainian delegation in London. So what is it about? Russia may receive, according to Trump's proposal, de jure recognition by the USA of Russia's control over Crimea, de facto recognition of Russia's occupation of parts of the Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions, a promise that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. At the same time, the text states that Ukraine may become a member of the European Union. The lifting of sanctions against Russia that were imposed starting from 2014, not even from the time of the full-scale invasion, but in fact, also those sanctions that were imposed against the Russian Federation for the annexation of Crimea. And what is of great interest to Russia, why it clings to this negotiation process: expansion of economic cooperation with the USA, particularly in the energy and industrial sectors. Well, it's specifically about the economy and energy, rare earth metals, minerals. It was for this very purpose that he traveled. Not long ago, Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's special representative, traveled to the USA for this very purpose, and this week he is expecting the special representative of President Trump, Steve Witkoff, in Moscow. This was confirmed by Ushakov, the aide to the Russian dictator Putin. So this is what it's about. Meanwhile, what is being offered to Ukraine? A reliable security guarantee involving a special group of European countries, and potentially also non-European like-minded countries. And interestingly, it concerns the return of a small part of the Kharkiv region occupied by Russian invaders. It is likely referring to the territory north of Vovchansk-Liptsi, this area possibly around Kupiansk, which would also be important. Unhindered passage along the Dnipro River, which runs along the front line in southern Ukraine. It is interesting how this can be implemented without creating a demilitarized zone there, because currently the Russians are systematically shelling, for example, Nikopol in the Dnipropetrovsk region across the Dnipro. This needs to be stopped then. Compensation and aid for reconstruction, although the document does not specify where the funding will come from. These are the conditions. We will discuss them further now because there are reports from other publications about what is being discussed. There is also talk about the ZNPP, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, that it will be a neutral zone controlled by the United States of America, by its specialists, energy experts, nuclear experts, and supplying electricity. ZNPP will be as if on occupied territory, also on the territory controlled by Ukraine. This is according to Axios. Then the British publication The Telegraph appeared, and Axios warns that this could be the last proposal from Donald Trump, the president of the USA. By the way, a very interesting thing arises because the Financial Times wrote the day before that supposedly US Secretary of State Rubio and Donald Trump's special representative Steve Witkoff will not go to London to meet with Ukrainian and European delegations. After all, as the publication notes, there were contradictions and different approaches to how and what to discuss. The Ukrainian delegation insists that an unconditional ceasefire must first be achieved, and in fact, we see for some reason. The American delegation begins to emphasize that it is already necessary to discuss the parameters of a peace agreement, getting ahead of things. Well, Ukraine, it seems to me, is absolutely pragmatic, reasoned, clear, and consistent. Wait, dear partners, you yourselves proposed such an order. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in his interviews, emphasized that there is a sequence of steps. First, a ceasefire must be achieved, and then move along the negotiation track. Well, these were the conditions that were essentially defined, so what can Ukraine talk about here then? Ideologically, let's ensure an effective ceasefire, and then we will discuss everything else and talk about possible parameters of a peace agreement. Under what conditions? Everything is clear, or is there simply a certain misunderstanding of the situation, the strategy, based on the fact that unfortunately, this is a fact. The USA is currently not applying additional pressure elements and leverage against Putin. But they are trying, in fact, including through media messages, to pressure Ukraine, at least. That is the impression given the circumstances we observe. By the way, friends, please write in the comments what you think about this. Your perspective is very interesting here, and there's another peace plan racing through the media. This time it's the British The Telegraph, a conservative publication. The British report, they provide a version of the plan proposed by the United States of America. So, the relinquishment of Crimea by Ukraine is something that all publications agree on now, including the New York Post, Washington Post. We see the Wall Street Journal has written about it, Financial Times, Axios, so many, because obviously this is not just by chance. It is indeed a key point. The President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, clearly addressed this issue at a briefing the day before, where he stated that Ukraine will not recognize Crimea as Russian, nor any other territories. They are temporarily occupied by Russia, but this is Ukrainian territory, as enshrined in the Constitution, as emphasized by the President of Ukraine. Accordingly, what is there to discuss here? The next point proposed as written by the Telegraph is the cessation of hostilities along the line of contact. That is, a freeze of hostilities, what is referred to as a frozen conflict. Next, once again, the lifting of all sanctions against Russia by the United States. This is also confirmed by Axios. It coincides here and was indirectly mentioned by the New York Post, a conservative publication close to the Republicans. The transfer of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant under US control, here too, there is a common position. Energy cooperation between the US and Russia. Direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia and no security guarantees. This point is different in the Telegraph compared to what other publications report. That is, here the Telegraph goes even further and states that direct negotiations must take place. Perhaps that is why there has been such an increase in activity in the Kremlin recently. Are so excited and talk about the need to be ready for negotiations there and so on. Ukraine's refusal to join NATO, but the possibility to join the EU, well, Axios writes the same thing. There is a match here, complete, and signing of an agreement on minerals. This plan will be presented by Trump's special representative for Ukraine, Kellogg, hopes to get Ukraine's final agreement. And Avetko, at this time, is supposed to go to Moscow, where he is eagerly awaited. They have grown very fond of him there, and Putin will tell him again. No nurses, various tales, hanging noodles on the ears, and he, perhaps, will be in his naivety, or maybe not out of naivety, seeing certain conditional units somewhere in some possible projects already about this. To ponder and perceive such conditions is what leading Western publications are currently discussing. Let's summarize, Buta. The first point is that the transfer of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to the USA needs to be ensured. Second, on which American and British publications are writing, about the proposal to recognize Crimea as Russian, to which I have already noted, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responded with a refusal. The next point is the refusal to retreat from NATO, but the possibility of integration into the European Union is still unclear. What are the security guarantees? Because earlier the American tabloid close to the Republicans, the New York Post, wrote that this could be the case. Still, a European military mission, as Ukraine wanted, however, for now, it is unclear, and the US will not object here. And even supposedly the US is ready to help financially, possibly even contribute to the funding of this mission specifically. Well, we'll see. So there is such a structure and there are such possibilities. Well, the signing of the agreement on rare earth metals and access to minerals is also something that runs as a cornerstone, mainly in Western media. Well, these are the conditions. But what comes next? Well, next it turns out that the United States will likely exert pressure accordingly, most likely on Ukraine, on Russia. Unfortunately, we currently see no elements of pressure, and this is a complicated situation, but let's move on. Let's imagine, theoretically, that Ukraine accepts some, not all, but some of these points. For example, a ceasefire along the front line, navigation on the Dnipro River, and so on. And Putin rejects it. What happens next? Well, what next? Do the USA withdraw from the negotiations? Okay, Putin continues to wage war. Putin continues to supply the Iranians and Houthis with missiles that shoot at American Reapers, bringing them down there. The cost of one Reaper drone is $30 million. Where do the Yemeni Houthi terrorists get such weapons? And many other questions. So what are the elements if Russia refuses? Do the USA withdraw? Or do the USA join forces with Russia and pressure Ukraine? This is the scenario. This is where the danger lies. But at the same time, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, expressed his readiness to meet with the president of the USA, Donald Trump. If Trump agrees and does not back out of this meeting, it could take place in the Vatican, in Rome. In the Vatican, on April 26th, there will be a farewell and funeral ceremony for Pope Francis. And that would be an opportunity. By the way, it would not be a bad idea because the head of the Council of Ministers of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, who recently visited Washington and had a good reception from Donald Trump, at the White House, she spoke about the need for the West to unite, and Trump promised to visit Rome. Perhaps this is the situation where all roads lead to Rome. We'll see. But despite everything, we must understand, as long as we have defense forces, as long as we have armed forces that continue to strike the enemy, that continue to destroy him, everything will be fine. Take care of yourselves and glory to Ukraine.